The Daily Derech. We are walking the path of holiness.
Hello, everybody. This is Rabbi Marcus Rubenstein. Welcome to the Daily Derech, a special project of exploring Judaism, the United Synagogue of Conservative Judaism, the Rabbinical Assembly, and Temple of Aaron. Today is the 6th day after Shabbat Kodesh, the 4th of Tammuz, 5786, corresponding in the secular calendar to Friday, June 19th, 2026. Tomorrow, we will read Parashat Korach. Let's begin. Me'am Loez. We're going to now learn Me'am Loez on Parashat Korach. Today is, I believe, our last day of learning this particular Parsha for this week. And we're going to do one last meditation really on Korach's behavior and specifically Moses' response to Korach's behavior. We find something very interesting in this Parsha. It's really one of the first times we see Moshe do something like this. He'll continue to do it again and again in multiple places, but this is really the first time he does this. We see a massive act of rebellion on the behalf of Bnei Israel by Korach and his party. And for the first time ever, we see that Moshe's head hits the ground. He kind of just looks like he gives up. He doesn't really try to argue with God that you should somehow forgive this people, etc., etc. But instead just says, he kind of just falls down and seems almost resigned. And it is a very interesting part because we consider Moshe a great leader. So what was going on here? And what is the meaning of what Moshe was doing at this moment? And why did he not pray for the forgiveness of the Jewish people to God as he's done other times? He does this many, many times. For example, first in the golden calf incident, then in the Mitonanim incident where the Jewish people begin complaining about meat and go way too far with that. And then finally in Parshat Shlach, in the Parsha of the spies, in which we just learned, we also see Moshe spends a long time trying to get God to forgive the Jewish people for the transgression of the negative report brought by the spies. So 3 times in a row, we see that the behavior from Moshe has been to stick with Bnei Israel and try to help them to achieve tshuva before Hashem, to atone before God. But we don't actually see it in this regard. Now, I think, look, there is a practical reality in this regard. This is the first time really that there's a rebellion against Moshe's leadership and Moshe's family. So maybe this is just too personal for him, and it wouldn't really make sense for him to argue on behalf of the Jewish people towards God. But that's not actually seemingly what the tradition, what the Midrash says, and certainly what Rashi says here, and not what the Me'am Loez has here. So I really want to bring what traditionally is thought of this particular moment. So usually a mashal, or an allegorical story, is brought. He says, we may think of it as follows. There was once a prince who aroused his father's anger, whereupon a good friend of his interceded for him 1 time, 2 times, and a 3rd time. But when he angered his father a 4th time, the friend was dismayed. How long can I go on expecting the king to suffer my interference? He demanded to know. And so I think from this allegorical story, obviously the king is God, the prince is the Jewish people as a whole, and God's good friend, Moshe, right? Or some kind of prime minister or something like that. And each time when the prince messes up, the Jewish people messes up, the prime minister has to beg for forgiveness from the king to help to push him and try to influence him to forgive the Jewish people. But on the 4th time, it seems like what this mashal is saying, this allegorical story is saying, is that the leader or the prime minister or the friend or whatever you want to call it in this allegory begins to get ashamed of this point and feel like, well, if my advice that the king seems to be following is causing him suffering, and the same thing seems to be happening again and again, Moses feels the need here to step back and say, God's going to do what God's going to do, and maybe I don't know the right answer. I don't know how to deal with these people, and obviously I'm going to try to always defend the Jewish people. But I think specifically in this case, of course, right, I'm not going to necessarily do that, and especially because they're going against me in particular. So I think what this represents from Moshe's attitude is, of course, Moses loves Bnei Israel, loves them dearly. And we see that over and over again. He's a wonderful leader and a wonderful lover and carer for the Jewish people. Truly takes responsibility for them. But Moses is also loyal to Hashem and also has this deep empathetic relationship with Hashem. And if you really have a deep empathetic relationship with Hashem, why would you ask the same thing over and over again from God if it doesn't seem to be working? Right? If it doesn't seem to be making Bnei Israel better and it does not seem to be making God's life any easier. At some point, there's a humility of saying, look, I've tried this 3 times and maybe it's time for God to try something else. And to have some humility, especially before Ribono Shel Olam, before the master of the universe. And that's actually what a good leader does when they've tried something 3 times and it just does not seem to be working. There's a time when they have to draw back and seek other ideas, seek other strategies. And I think that's what we see Moshe here. So we can actually say maybe this is actually good leadership. It's humble leadership on the part of Moshe. He still loves the Jewish people, but it's time for God to decide what that relationship is going to be. I want to see in also a bigger aspect. I think as a Jew, we are both committed to Bnei Israel and to God. And that's sometimes a very difficult thing. We're supposed to love our fellow Jew and care for them and fight for them and try to defend them and take responsibility for them, just as Moshe had. But we're also committed in the same way to Hashem. And sometimes those things often can be in tension, right? If Bnei Israel is going astray and they're doing things that are not according to God's will, okay, a certain amount we could say, look, they're just learning, they're getting there eventually, but eventually you kind of had to say, well, God's going to have to deal with this separately, right? I'm going to continue trying to do what's right, but I'm going to detach myself from this. And honestly, in many conversations, many issues, that's something that goes through my head. What matters more at this moment, loyalty to Bnei Israel and care for them, or my loyalty to Hashem and loyalty to God? And those things are balanced. And by the way, should be balanced. Many faith traditions would say, well, God always comes first. Not in Judaism. Actually, sometimes Bnei Israel comes first over God. It happens often in the Jewish tradition. But they both of those relationships must be maintained, and the respect for them must be maintained. And this is part of the uniqueness of balanced Jewish spirituality. Mishnah Torah. We're going to continue learning the laws of the recitation of the Shema, really focusing today on the morning Shema and continuing to discuss some of the obligations surrounding it. In our previous episode, when talking about the time at which to say Kriat Shema, remember that Rambam said that the ideal time to say the Kriat Shema is right before Netzach Hama, right before what we would call sunrise. But we have until 3 hours in the day, 3 halachic hours in the day, in order to actually say the Shema after the fact. And then after that, so then the question that comes is, we have this time limit. Well, what happens before that time and after that time? And that's what we're going to try to talk about today. Mishikdim, one who is over hasty and recites the Shema of the morning prayers after dawn, even though he finishes before sunrise, fulfills his obligation. Right? So technically, one should finish one's Shema as sunrise begins and then move on after the Emet V'Yatziv blessing into the Amidah. But Rambam says, at least according to his system, of course, one still fulfills his obligation, even if one says Shema beginning at dawn. Now, this is important because easily one could say, well, Kriyat Shema, the time actually begins at sunrise itself, right? If it needs to be said in the morning, it's interesting here that he says that one who says the Shema starting at dawn, which is when there's first glimmer of light in the sky, what's called Alot HaShachar or Amud HaShachar in Hebrew, this is a time of doubtful daytime. That's the period between dawn and actual sunrise is doubtful whether it's actually night or day. So it's interesting here that he says this Torah obligation of reciting the Shema in the morning actually can be said at this doubtful time. Obviously, further research would be needed to understand why he says this here, but at least he says this. In extraordinary circumstances, e.g. one who rises in order to travel, one may recite it at the outset from dawn. So he says, Latchila, though, even from the outset, one can begin to say this Kriyat Shema at dawn. Let's say if one needs to catch an early train or an early plane or something like that and is going to be busy all the rest of the day, if it means he's not going to be able to say a Shema, he could from the outset set out to recite the Shema at that time and plan for it. So very, very important with this regard. And I think it really does show how serious the Rambam is of like saying that one should really aim for Netzach Hama, for the rising of the sun, for saying the morning Shema. This is somewhat, I think, unique to the Rambam, but I think it's interesting and very beautiful here. Well, what happens afterwards? Right, this happens to all of us. One who recited the Shema after the end of the third hour, even if he was unavoidably detained, does not fulfill his obligation to recite the Shema at its proper time. So now you've basically lost this mitzvah and you've transgressed a positive commandment to recite the Shema in the morning. So you've lost the positive commandment and you've lost this biblical mitzvah. And so it really is important that we really, at absolute minimum, at least are able to recite the Shema within the first 3 hours of the morning. Okay, very good goal to set oneself. But what happens if afterwards you still say it? He can be compared to one who studies Torah. He should recite the blessings preceding and after it all day. By the way, the Rambam doesn't say it here, but really good to say it. The blessings themselves that surround the Shema, unlike the Shema, can actually be said until halachic noon, which is around, noon. But if you do that, and if you're davening later, which, sometimes happens, we're not perfect people, we're not angels. If you do this, it's still proper to say the Shema and the Ve'ahavta, even though it doesn't count as a mitzvah, at least of reciting the Shema, it does still count as a mitzvah of studying Torah, which of course is an important mitzvah. So you should definitely continue you should still say it if you're going to daven even after the third hour. So I think this is an important understanding, and I think what it shows in the Rambam is that there are going to be people who violate this mitzvah sometimes, and so we shouldn't feel overly wrought or overly guilty if we do miss it. But yet we should try to set up our schedules as best as possible to fulfill this positive mitzvah in the Torah. Obviously, very, very important. We'll continue with chapter 2 on the new week. Menorat HaMaor. We're going to continue learning that introduction to the first candle, and we're going to continue talking about this idea of positive jealousy or doing something for the sanctification of God's name. And we just learned that rather difficult story yesterday, if you were listening. Not easy, and these concepts are really hard when taken of how do we apply this to the modern American world in which we live in which we all have different faiths and values. But I still think it's proper for us to learn it, internalize these values, and understand that this is an important part of Judaism. It's just going to require a lot more reflection of really how to put this in practice in firm guidelines in the world today. So Menorat HaMaor continues, therefore the early pious ones, Hasidim HaRishonim, would place themselves in danger for the sanctification of God's name, in order to remove thorns from the vineyards, to rebuke and discipline those who walked in an improper path. So very interesting, the kind of reading between the lines of what he's saying here. He's using this line from a few stories ago of removing thorns from the vineyard. This is actually, I believe, Rabbi Elazar ben Rabbi Shimon, in the story we previously talked about with him. This idea of removing criminals from the Jewish people and bringing them to justice is like removing thorns from a vineyard, i.e. improving it. So this is a very important path. But it's interesting what he says here, that he calls this the early pious ones. He didn't say all Jews should do this, but rather the early pious ones. And so that's really interesting. The pious ones is already kind of removed, meaning this is not an obligation. This is not, it's not that every Jew needs to put themselves in harm's way in order to, do justice for God. That's not a requirement of Judaism. But is it an ideal? And that's where it's interesting. He says, Chasidim Rishonim, the early pious ones, the people who are super pious and super pure, were able to do this. But I think the implication here is maybe we're not able to do this in the same way as before. But yet it should still, of course, serve as an inspiration to us. There's a particular story he's going to bring with regard to this that I think illustrates the matter quite well. Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai said, it is permitted to provoke the wicked in this world. As is stated, those who forsake the Torah praise the wicked, but those who keep the Torah contend with them. And so it's interesting, this sugya in this story within the Gemara and this conversation I've taught many times. It's a beautiful, extremely, extremely rich agarata. I can't get into all the details today just due to time constraints, but we'll try to get the nafkamina. We'll try to get what comes out of this in a simple way. So Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying here that usually one might think it's forbidden to provoke the wicked in this world. Why? Because it's going to put our life in danger, and anything that puts our life in danger is actually forbidden to us as Jews for the most part. We're not allowed to lose our life for the sake of Judaism, and we're obligated to protect it with everything we have. But Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is saying actually it's permitted. It's permitted in this particular case to provoke the wicked in this world. Now, if this is going to mean you're necessarily going to get killed for this, I don't think Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai would say this. But the language of the Hebrew is kind of like irritate or prod the wicked in this world. And he based on the Proverbs verse in 28:4 that says, those who forsake the Torah praise the wicked, but those who keep the Torah contend with them. So part of keeping the Torah, I think the way that Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is understanding this Proverbs verse is that actually by like flattering the wicked, even though you don't actually join them, is actually considered forsaking the Torah and leaving the Torah behind. This is something that is an abomination to Judaism and to God to do such a thing. But actually, what it means to keep the Torah actually is to contend with them, to irritate them, to fight them, to try to bring justice in the world. I think what I said before, though, is still important. If a person whispers to you saying, but is it not written of David, do not contend with evildoers? So there's a psalm verse in the beginning of the 37th psalm that says, do not contend with evildoers, which at least some would interpret by meaning, don't get involved with them at all. Just stay away, right? Better just to keep doing goodness in your loneliness, in your aloneness, and just disconnect yourself because you might become influenced by them yourself. So maybe it's better not to even get involved in the first place. This is what I would call Jewish quietism, right? To just, do your spiritual life by yourself and don't worry about what anyone else does. There's an important perspective of that within Judaism. But at least what the Gemara says here, in sort of the language, is this creeping thought might come into your head that maybe I shouldn't get involved. Maybe it's actually better for me just to do my avodat Hashem alone, my service of God alone, and just not worry about it. One should say to him, one whose heart troubles him says such a thing. Meaning one who has a lot of anxiety says such a thing. And rather the meaning of do not contend with evildoers is do not become like the evildoers and do not envy those who do wrong. Meaning, so at least the way that the Rashbi, Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai, is interpreting this particular verse that seems to disagree with what he said previously is that it's not don't fight with evildoers or don't try to stop them from doing what they're doing, but rather don't envy them. Don't try to become like them. Because that also might happen. Now, I don't know. I think Rabbi Shimon Bar Yochai is sort of lessening and flattening this argument within the Gemara, and I also think the way the Menorat HaMaor is printing it also is flattening this sort of conversation itself within the Gemara. So I might interpret it a little bit differently, but I think in the context of this conversation, what he's saying still is important. As it is written, let not your heart envy sinners. Say to him, one who's, and so he says, let not your heart envy sinners. And likewise, Solomon says, do not contend with evildoers, do not envy the wicked. So again, all this to say, it's permitted in this world. You might think I should just stay alone, not bother anyone, but actually no. It's a good thing. It's a really good thing to try to be zealous for Hashem and to try to do justice in the world. And even if it means contending with people who are wicked and getting involved in hard things, that is seen as commendable. That being said, I think it's extremely complicated in our modern world. And if you're thinking of doing such a thing, honestly, I would talk to a rabbi and have a longer discussion with it to understand, the ins and outs of this halacha and ins and outs of this idea. And honestly, probably a long shiur on this would probably be good. You could probably actually write a whole entire book on this to explain sort of the Jewish path in this of, hey, it's a good book idea for the future if I ever have time for such a thing. Well, that's it for today, everybody. Thank you so much for listening to the Daily Derech. If you have any questions, comments, or concerns, please feel free to email me anytime at rmr@templeofaaron.org. thank you so much for listening. There are so many people to thank, and you can look in the show notes for that. And also, if you want to know and see any of these texts in the original, we actually have that too. You can actually find that in our episode description. So look in each of the episode descriptions and you'll find that information right there. Thank you very much. Have a great day, everybody.